At 11 minutes past 4, on a Thursday afternoon, when most of Larkminster was engaged in the serious business of pretending not to notice one another's curtains, the clock tower bell struck 6. It did so with a forceful confidence, wholly out of keeping with the facts. Two boys halted in the square and looked up. Mrs. Veal, emerging from the grocer's with a net bag of oranges and an expression of permanent disappointment, stopped in the middle of the pavement. The vicar, who had just bicycled past the war memorial and was at that moment thinking not especially devout thoughts about a cracked drain pipe, nearly rode into the florist's display of chrysanthemums. Even the crows, which generally took a broad-minded view of village absurdity, shifted along the church roof with something that might almost have been professional concern. Then the bell gave a second strike, a third, and carried on until it had fully committed itself to 6. Nobody in Larkminster liked the clock tower very much. It stood at the eastern edge of the square, attached by a narrow stone passage to what had once been the municipal hall and was now used for meetings, jumble sales, amateur recitals, and those committees which arise in English villages whenever there is money to be raised or disapproval to be organized. The tower had been built in a period of civic optimism, now difficult to account for, and its brick face had weathered into an expression of gloomy self-importance. The clock itself had not kept reliable time in 20 years, which was perhaps why the bell's sudden determination attracted more notice than a correct hour might have done. "It's drunk," said one of the boys. "Hush," said Mrs. Veal automatically, although she was plainly of the same opinion. By 4:30 there were 11 people in the square discussing the matter with varying levels of uselessness. The general conclusion, if such a term may be allowed for several incompatible remarks made over one another, was that either the mechanism had slipped, some person had interfered with it, or modern standards were everywhere in decline. Mr. Pottle, who kept the ironmonger's shop and distrusted all mechanisms introduced after 1938, pronounced that gears no longer possessed moral discipline. Miss Hatherley from the post office said it was probably birds. Nobody explained how birds might manage 6 full bell strokes, but this omission did not greatly weaken her position. It was during this phase of village analysis that Miss Edith Cresswell crossed the square from the direction of the lending library, paused under the tower, and looked up rather longer than the occasion seemed to justify. Miss Cresswell was not by nature theatrical. She was a narrow, correct woman of 56, with a hat always pinned in the exact center of her head, and gloves which suggested that human fingers were fundamentally regrettable. For 22 years she had served as secretary to the Parish Improvement Committee, a body chiefly concerned with preserving Larkminster from anything that might make it cheerful. Her habits were exact, her opinions careful, and her friendships so limited as to appear almost curated. So when she remained standing under the tower, one hand resting against the strap of her handbag, and failed to join in the general speaking, Mrs. Veal noticed it at once. "Are you unwell, Miss Cresswell?" Miss Cresswell looked round. For an instant, not more than that, she seemed not to know where she was. Then composure returned with visible effort. "No," she said. "No, not at all. Only the bell was so very sudden. It gave us all a start," said Mrs. Veal, disappointed to find no greater drama available. "Yes." Miss Cresswell glanced toward the side passage leading into the hall. "Has anyone been up there?" Mr. Pottle followed her gaze. "Up where?" "In the tower." "How should we know?" said Mrs. Veal. "We were not taking attendance." Miss Cresswell pressed her lips together. "Quite." She moved on almost immediately, but not before the vicar, who had dismounted, and was standing with one hand on his bicycle handlebars, observed that she looked pale. "I dare say it's nothing," he said kindly. "That," replied Mrs. Veal, shifting her oranges from one arm to the other, "is what people always say shortly before it becomes something." The remark, though uncharitable, proved serviceable. At 5 o'clock, the caretaker of the hall, Mr. Len Bixby, was found not in his customary place near the side entrance with a broom and a face of injured patients, but absent altogether. This was irregular. Mr. Bixby disliked leaving premises unsupervised because, as he often remarked, unattended buildings encouraged committees. He was a stooping man in his late 60s with heavy brows and an air of having long ago abandoned hope that others might behave sensibly. If he could be said to have an affection, it was reserved for keys. He kept them on 2 iron rings attached by a chain to his belt, and treated any request to borrow one as if it were a preliminary to moral collapse. By 5:10, when he had still not appeared, the matter began to acquire shape. The first person to make anything of it was Mrs. Dallimore, who lived in the cottage opposite the passage and spent a considerable portion of her life at her front window, not from vulgar curiosity, as she would have hotly maintained, but from a disciplined concern for visible reality. She crossed the square with a cardigan drawn tightly about her, and announced, to no one in particular and therefore to everyone, "I saw Mr. Bixby go into the hall at 3:15, and I have not seen him come out." There was a silence of the gratifying kind that villagers value. "Perhaps he is asleep," suggested the vicar. Mrs. Dallimore gave him a look which implied that theology had softened his mind. "Standing up, not necessarily standing up." At this, Mr. Pottle said, "Someone ought to have a look." Nobody disputed it, though there followed the customary interval in which everybody hopes someone else will perform the necessary public spirit. The vicar eventually leaned his bicycle against the railings, and volunteered himself with the subdued resignation of a man who had spent years being first to unpleasant tasks, because he had once made the mistake of seeming decent. Miss Cresswell, who had by then reappeared at the edge of the gathering with a folded library book under her arm, said quickly, "I think I should come." The vicar turned. "There is no reason to trouble yourself." "I am not troubled." Her tone made it discourteous to continue resisting. The two of them went down the narrow passage together, disappearing beneath the arch that led to the municipal hall side door. The small crowd remained in the square in an attitude of strained casualness. Two people pretended to discuss dahlias. One of the boys was sent home and did not go. Mrs. Veal adjusted her bag so often that the oranges began to suffer. They had not been gone a full minute when the vicar reappeared alone. Even at a distance his face had altered. "Mr. Pottle," he called, and his voice was careful in the way voices become when care is already too late. "Would you come here, please?" Nobody moved at first except Miss Cresswell, who came out behind him and stood with one hand against the wall. She did not faint, which in some ways would have simplified matters. She merely looked at the square as if it belonged to another country. Mrs. Veal advanced 3 paces. "What is it?" The vicar did not answer her. "Please," he said again to Mr. Pottle. Mr. Pottle went. By 5:30 the doctor had been telephoned, the constable sent for from Market Reston, and the square had acquired that peculiar hush in which people speak quietly, not from respect but from appetite. Word moved faster than bicycles. Before 6, half the village knew that Len Bixby had been found dead inside the clock tower stairwell, and by 6:15, almost as many knew it inaccurately. He had not been hanged, though some said he had. He had not fallen from the belfry, though this proved popular. He had not, as one particularly inventive report suggested, been crushed by the clock weights. The truth, when it came in its plainest form, was less dramatic and therefore more disturbing. He had been found at the foot of the spiral stairs leading upward to the clock chamber, lying on his side, one hand under him, as though he had sat down unexpectedly and never risen again. Near him, on the stone floor, lay one of his key rings. That detail was repeated often, and with satisfaction, not because anyone knew what it meant, but because objects on floors lend dignity to confusion. Dr. Fanshawe arrived at 6:20, carrying his bag and an expression which combined fatigue, competence, and long acquaintance with the human tendency to die at inconvenient hours. He went inside. The constable followed. The crowd remained where it was until shooed into looser clusters by the vicar, who continued to perform small useless kindnesses because larger ones were not available. Miss Cresswell had by then been persuaded to sit in the reading room across the square, with a cup of tea she did not drink. Mrs. Dallimore stayed with her, chiefly so that she might later claim not to have left the poor woman alone. Through the glass door one could see Miss Cresswell sitting bolt upright, both gloved hands around the teacup, her face composed in that rigid, deliberate manner by which some people keep emotion from becoming public property. "What I should like to know," said Mrs. Veal in a lowered voice outside, "is what he was doing in the tower." Mr. Pottle, returning at last from the passage, answered with more gravity than he commonly employed. "That," he said, "is not presently known, but someone rang that bell." Nobody contradicted her. Above them, the clock face stared over the square in its usual crooked indifference. The evening had grown chill. Shop blinds were being pulled down one by one. Somewhere behind the butcher's, a dog barked at nothing visible. Life, with its usual tactlessness, continued. At 7 o'clock Inspector Pirbright was sent for from Belcarrow. He was not a man to hurry, merely because others had begun doing so. Yet when the message reached him and he heard, First, that a village caretaker had been found dead at the base of a clock tower stair, and second, that the bell had rung 6 at 11 minutes past 4. He set down his cup without finishing it. That, he said mildly, sounds like either nonsense or intention. And as his car took the road toward Larkminster through the darkening lanes, the village square settled deeper into speculation, while above it all the old tower kept its own counsel. Inspector Pirbright arrived in Larkminster shortly after 7:30, at the hour when villages become most self-conscious. Curtains were not yet fully drawn, which meant one might still be observing. Lamps had come on in front rooms, showing islands of yellow light, framed silhouettes, and the occasional household in which nobody had yet decided whether the evening would be spent in dignity or argument. The square itself lay under a thin wash of mist, enough to soften the edges of the clock tower without making it romantic. Romanticism did not suit municipal brick. Pirbright left his car beside the reading room and stood for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, looking up at the dark face of the clock. It showed 23 minutes to 5. This, after the events of the afternoon, seemed less an error than a private opinion. Superintendent's men were not available for every village disturbance, and Pirbright, though not old, had the settled air of someone who had spent many years being sent where other people had already been unhelpful. He was square-shouldered, neat without flourish, and possessed of a patience that could feel kindly until one discovered that it was also exact. He did not waste motion, he did not waste theories, and though he was polite enough to invite explanation, many found after meeting him that they had explained more than they meant to. Constable Blaine met him at the entrance to the side passage, stamping his feet against the cold. Blaine was young, broad in the face, and still at the age where duty gave him a visible stiffness, as though he feared competence might leak out through a careless posture. "Evening, sir." Pirbright nodded. "What have we?" "Male, late 60s, Leonard Bixby, caretaker here for years, found at foot of the tower stair by Reverend Cade and Miss Cresswell, about 5:15. Doctor says dead before they found him, though not by very much. No signs of robbery. No sign anyone else remained on the premises when we got here. Cause, doctor wouldn't commit himself at once. Said there's a wound at the back of the head, but not a spectacular one. Could be fall, could be blow, could be one encouraging the other. That is admirably inconclusive." "Yes, sir." Pirbright glanced toward the square, where 3 separate groups of villagers were pretending to be on unrelated errands. "And the bell?" "Struck 6 at 11 past 4. Several heard it. No one yet knows why. No one ever knows why bells do anything," said Pirbright. "They merely ring and leave others to explain them." He ducked into the passage and entered the hall. The side corridor smelled faintly of polish, damp stone and old notices. On the walls curling handbills advertised harvest suppers, amateur Gilbert and Sullivan, and a lecture on local drainage that had by its poor attendance vindicated itself. At the end of the corridor a narrow oak door stood open. Beyond it, the tower stair rose in a tight spiral of worn stone around a central shaft. Dr. Fanshawe was waiting near the foot of the stairs, with the mild impatience of a man whose work had already been done but not yet believed. The body had not been removed. Leonard Bixby lay on his side where he had fallen, his jacket twisted, one arm bent awkwardly beneath him. Death had reduced neither his obstinacy nor his general air of grievance. His brows still seemed knit against some failure of standards. Pirbright crouched beside him, careful not to touch. The back of the head showed a darkened patch where hair had clotted. One shoe was half unlaced. The right hand, stiffening now, was empty. On the flags near the wall lay a heavy ring of keys. Fanshawe said, "He did not die of old age, if that helps. It narrows the field. There is a cranial injury, severe enough to kill, though whether it came from striking the stone or from being struck before the fall, I'll say properly after examination. No obvious defensive wounds, no sign of prolonged struggle. He may have been taken by surprise. Time? Somewhere between 4 and 5. Near enough." Pirbright looked up the stair. "And the bell mechanism? Above." "I have not taken an interest in it," Fanshawe said. "I leave village clocks to more spiritual minds." Pirbright's gaze returned to the keys. "Which of these opens what?" Blaine answered. "Ring found on the floor appears to be one of Bixby's regular sets. We've not matched every key yet. There should be 2 rings, according to several people. Several people are a poor substitute for certainty, but they are what villages provide." He stood. "Who found him precisely?" "Reverend Cade and Miss Edith Cresswell, together." Yes, sir. Pirbright gave the smallest pause, not because the thing was remarkable in itself, but because people seldom found bodies in pairs without each becoming quietly alert to the other's usefulness as a witness. Take me through it. Blaine did so. The bell, the gathering in the square, Bixby's absence, Mrs. Dallamore's statement that she had seen him enter the hall before 4 and not come out again, the vicar and Miss Cresswell going in together, the discovery, the messages sent. Pirbright listened without interruption. When Blaine had finished, he said, "Which of them spoke first after seeing the body?" The Reverend called for Mr. Pottle. "Not what I asked." Blaine frowned, rewinding memory. Miss Cresswell said nothing at once, so far as I know. "That," said Pirbright mildly, "is an answer." He examined the stair entrance, the floor, the wall, then the dead man's clothing as far as he could without disturbing it. Bixby's jacket pockets bulged slightly. The right trouser pocket sat oddly, pulled outward as though weighted. Pirbright looked toward the doctor. "May I?" Fanshawe made a small gesture of consent. "You may do what my profession will later complain of." "Yes." Pirbright reached into the right trouser pocket and drew out a single large brass key. It was older than the others on the ring near the wall and more polished from use. Its bow was broad and oval, its stem long, its bit cut in an elaborate pattern belonging to heavier locks than one usually met in modern cupboards. A strip of fading red cloth had been knotted through the ring at its head. Blaine stared. "That wasn't with the others." "No," said Pirbright. "It was in the wrong pocket." He held it up to the corridor light. "Did anyone mention a separate key?" "Not to me." "Then either nobody knew about it, or nobody wished to begin with it." He glanced down at Bixby again. "Men who live by keys generally arrange them with affection. One does not ordinarily carry a favorite loose in one's pocket, unless it has been put there for speed, secrecy, or recent use." Pirbright had met enough caretakers, vergers, wardens, and petty guardians of premises to know that their keys formed a kind of moral map. They knew which locks mattered. They knew who must not be trusted with what, and when one key departed from the pattern, it usually did so for a reason. "Have we identified the tower door key?" he asked. Blaine indicated the ring on the floor. "Likely there, sir. One of these opened the side entrance, and one fits the lower storeroom." Bixby carried all building access, according to the committee chairman. "Who is the committee chairman?" "Mrs. Holcomb." "That sounds improving." Pirbright crossed to the open tower stair and looked up. The spiral turned tightly into shadow. Above, somewhere beyond sight, the clock chamber and belfry sat inside the brick shaft, like thoughts no one had wanted aired for years. The stones were worn concave at the center by generations of feet. On the third step there was a faint smear, perhaps mud, perhaps something else. He noted it and said nothing. "Has anyone gone up since the body was found?" "Only the doctor, a few steps, and me with a lamp." "Not all the way." "Good. We shall preserve at least one ignorance." He turned back into the corridor. "Bring the vicar first, then Miss Cresswell, separately." Reverend Cade came from the reading room with visible willingness, which Pirbright liked no more and no less than reluctance. Clergymen could be useful witnesses if one remembered that their profession trained them to smooth distress into language. Calder was in his early 40s, thin, thoughtful, and still carrying the embarrassment of having discovered death in public. He described the afternoon carefully. The bell, the speculation, Bixby's unexplained absence, Mrs. Dallamore's statement, Miss Cresswell volunteering to accompany him into the passage. "She seemed anxious," said Pirbright. "Yes, though perhaps that is easy to say now. Easy things are often said now." "Did she tell you why she wished to come?" "No, only that she thought she should." "And when you found the body?" Calder's face altered slightly. "He was just there, in the lamp's throw. I saw him first. Miss Cresswell was behind me. I believe she caught sight of him at once. She made a sort of sound, but not a scream, more breath stopped by surprise." Pirbright let that rest. "Did you notice the keys? The ring on the floor?" "Yes. A loose brass key. Large. Red cloth tied through it." Calder shook his head at once. "No. Did Bixby customarily keep such a thing?" "I couldn't say. He had keys enough to start a principality." When Cade had gone, Miss Cresswell entered with composure that had required recent labor. She had removed her gloves, perhaps because teacups demand it, and her hands now lay clasped before her with great precision. There was color in her face again, though not much. Pirbright asked the same questions, differently. Her answers were orderly. She had been at the library, she heard the bell, she crossed the square. She had wondered whether something was wrong because Bixby ought to have appeared. When the vicar proposed looking in the hall, she accompanied him. They found the body. She had been shocked. You asked in the square whether anyone had been up in the tower, Pirbright said. Her fingers tightened, then stilled. Did I? So I am told. I suppose I did. The bell had rung. It seemed sensible. Sensible is often retrospective. Why did it occur to you before it occurred to others? For the first time she looked directly at him with something sharper than nervousness. Because, she said, unlike others, Inspector, I do occasionally connect one thing with another. It was not an answer, but it had style. Pirbright inclined his head. Quite. Did you know Mr. Bixby well as one knows a caretaker? We served on hall matters together. He could be difficult. In what way? He believed access was a privilege to be conferred according to moral worthiness, much of which he personally assessed. A serious man then. In a petty sphere, yes. Pirbright drew the brass key from his pocket and laid it on the table between them. The effect was immediate, though small. Her eyes dropped to it, and for one instant did not rise. You recognize it, he said. Miss Cresswell answered a second too late. No. He did not contradict her. He merely covered the key again with his hand. Outside, the square murmured under the mist, and the tower stood over it all, black against the last thinning grey. Inside the corridor, with the dead caretaker still waiting to be taken away, and one old key suddenly more interesting than any bell, Inspector Pirbright began to feel that Larkminster had not been careless this afternoon. It had been interrupted. By 8 o'clock the body had been removed, though Larkminster showed no signs of feeling relieved by it. Villages are not improved by the mere absence of a corpse. They continue to hold it in mind with a kind of collective tidiness, placing it mentally where it had been found and returning to it at intervals, as one returns to a bill left on the mantelpiece. The square had thinned only a little. Lamps shone behind curtains. Small currents of conversation moved from gate to gate, path to path, and front room to front room, carrying half-facts with the assurance of complete ones. Pirbright remained in the hall until the doctor and the men from Belcarrow had gone. He made one slow circuit of the ground floor, looked into the supply cupboard, the committee room, and the little kitchen with its metal sink and stout smell of old tea, then stood again at the foot of the stair and considered the tower. The hour and the dead man could not be disentangled. That much was already plain. Whether the key in the wrong pocket belonged to the same knot was another matter. It usually did no harm, Pirbright found, to resist joining facts together until they had first had the decency to stand upright. Constable Blaine came back from the entrance passage. Reading rooms still open, sir. Mrs. Veal asked whether we required refreshments, in a tone suggesting she would know if we did. That is the proper civic spirit, said Pirbright. We'll go across. The reading room stood opposite the square, a long low building of mellow stone, which had begun life as a schoolroom, and now survived by being useful to everybody in different degrees. Books stood in glass-fronted cases along one wall. Newspapers hung from rods by the window, and in the back room there was a hatch, a kettle, and enough cups to sustain either fellowship or inquiry, depending on the occasion. Tonight it was doing both. 3 women fell quiet when Pirbright entered, then resumed conversation too brightly. Mrs. Dallimore sat nearest the fire, her body already arranged to suggest that she had no intention of being sent home before knowledge was complete. Mrs. Veal stood by the tea-table, directing cups with chilly authority. Miss Cresswell was no longer there. Inspector, said Mrs. Veal, you'll want something hot. I rarely oppose it. She poured with a severity that turned hospitality into assessment. Pirbright accepted the cup, and sat at one of the reading tables beneath a framed map of the county that had faded into a general theory of green. Blaine remained near the door, grateful enough to hold his saucer in both hands. I understand, said Pirbright, that several people were in the square when the bell rang. Mrs. Dallimore gave a sound halfway between a laugh and a sniff. Several? Half the village had an opinion within 3 minutes. Whether they had an ear for bells is another matter. Let us begin with yours. She accepted this as the tribute it was. It rang 6, at 11 minutes past 4. I know because I had just looked at my mantel clock. It loses 2 minutes a week, but I correct for it. Pirbright had no difficulty believing this. And Mr. Baisby, I saw him go into the side passage at 3:45 exactly, carrying his usual key rings. He did not come out again. Mrs. Veal set down the teapot with a muted click. Unless he came out while Mrs. Dallimore was blinking. I do not blink for long, said Mrs. Dallimore. No one suggested you did it professionally. Pirbright sipped his tea. It was stronger than courtesy strictly required. Had either of you spoken to Mr. Bixby today? I had not, said Mrs. Dallimore. He and I were not social, Mrs. Veal said. I asked him on Tuesday whether the upper hall would be open for the church embroidery display next month. He said that depended on whether people had lately remembered that pins do not improve wooden floors. Did that answer your question? Not remotely, but it satisfied him. Blaine made a sound that might have been the beginning of a smile. Pirbright turned slightly toward Mrs. Veal. Was he disliked? Not dramatically. One does not have dramatic feelings about caretakers. One is merely obstructed by them. Someone may have felt more than obstructed. Mrs. Veal folded her hands. In villages, Inspector, temper is often real, and murder still inconvenient. That was sensible enough to keep. Pirbright let his glance move over the room. A register lay open on the side desk where returned books were entered in a careful clerkly hand. On the window ledge stood a row of potted cuttings that had either been donated or abandoned by the Women's Fellowship. The air held the smell of paper, dust and boiled water. It was a room designed for mild order, and tonight that order had been conscripted into waiting. When Miss Cresswell came in after the discovery, he asked, "How did she seem?" Mrs. Dallimore answered first. "Shaken," Mrs. Veal said. "Controlled." Both were true, which made the combination useful. "She would not drink her tea," Mrs. Dallimore went on. "Just held the cup. I remained with her because no one ought to be left alone after seeing a thing like that." Mrs. Veal's eyebrows moved a fraction. "You remained because you dislike gaps in a narrative." Mrs. Dallimore turned her head. "I dislike preventable ignorance." Pirbright intervened before the exchange improved further. "Did she say anything?" "Very little," said Mrs. Dallimore. "Only once, when the doctor came out. She asked whether Mr. Bixby had suffered. The doctor said he hoped not for long. She looked relieved at that, though whether for his sake or hers I couldn't swear." Mrs. Veal rearranged spoons which did not require it. She also asked whether the tower would be locked. Pirbright set down his cup. "Exactly what did she say?" Mrs. Veal considered. "Something like, 'I suppose no one will be allowed up there now.' Very calm. Too calm, perhaps. But then some women are brought up to regard emotion as a public stain." "That is not unique to women," said Pirbright. "No," said Mrs. Veal. "Only more heavily enforced." The room grew quiet for a moment. Through the wall one could hear the small wind-bothered rattle of the square's signpost. Somewhere in the front room, an old man coughed over the evening paper with the persistence of habit rather than illness. Pirbright said, "Who had reason to be in the tower this afternoon?" Mrs. Dallimore lifted her shoulders. "Mr. Bixby, if the clock had gone wrong again." Mrs. Veal added, "Or anyone wanting privacy in an inconvenient place. Was it used for that?" She gave him a flat look. "Not romantically, Inspector. There are limits even in Larkminster. That narrows things." Mrs. Dallimore leaned forward. "There is the committee storage on the landing below the clock chamber. Old records, banners, parish documents, fete materials, and things no one will throw away because someone dead once labelled them important." Pirbright watched her. "And how do you know that?" "Because when the hall roof leaked last winter, they moved several boxes through the square under tarpaulins, and made a disgraceful business of not sorting them afterward." Mrs. Veal said, with some reluctance, "Miss Cresswell has to do with that sort of thing. She keeps records." Pirbright did not at once answer. He looked at the tea in his cup, then beyond it to the hatch where another kettle simmered. On the face of it, there was nothing suspicious in a committee secretary having records in a committee building, yet Miss Cresswell's first public instinct after the bell had been to ask whether anyone had gone up into the tower, and when shown the brass key, she had denied recognizing it a little too carefully to make ignorance persuasive. "Does she still keep the older papers?" he asked. "Oh yes," said Mrs. Dallimore. "Minutes, subscriptions, correspondence, donation books, complaints, commemorative programs, appeals, petitions. If the village sneezed in triplicate in 1958, Miss Cresswell can likely produce the tissue. She is efficient," said Miss Veal, which from her amounted to high praise, wrapped in mild disapproval. A clatter came from the front room. The young library volunteer, Alice Morvan, appeared at the doorway, carrying a tray of washed cups. She was 23, fair, competent, and had the alert expression of someone accustomed to older people saying things in front of her, as though youth were a form of furniture. She hesitated on seeing Pirbright. "Sorry," she said. "I didn't know." "You may continue being useful," said Mrs. Veal. Alice set down the tray. Pirbright asked, "Were you here this afternoon?" "Until just after 4. I was shelving periodicals." "Did you hear the bell?" "Everybody heard the bell." "Did you notice anyone go into the hall passage before or after it?" Alice thought. "Mr. Bisbee went in earlier. I saw him from the front window, and Miss Cresswell crossed the square after the bell." She looked up at the tower first. Mrs. Dallimore made a tiny sound of vindication. Youth, it seemed, could occasionally be relied upon. "Did Miss Cresswell come in here before the body was found?" Pirbright asked. "No. Afterward, yes. She sat there." Alice pointed to the chair near the fire. "She asked me whether the kettle had just boiled." It had. That seemed to matter to her for some reason. Pirbright let the oddity settle where it belonged. Not yet significant, but unwilling to vanish. Had she been in the reading room earlier in the day? She returned a book at about 3:30. "What book?" Alice blinked, then crossed to the register. "It's here. County Benefactors and Public Trusts. 1840-1910. Mrs. Veal stared. "People borrow that voluntarily?" Alice allowed herself the smallest smile. "Apparently." Pirbright rose and went to the register. The entry was in Alice's hand, dated that afternoon. Miss Edith Cresswell. The title beneath it looked exactly as tedious as claimed. He asked, "Did she take another book?" "No. She said she only wanted to bring that one back before the library closed, and then she lingered in the square after the bell." "Yes." Pirbright thanked her, and returned to the table. Public trusts, old donations, committee records stored in the tower, a caretaker dead on the stairs, and one brass key with a red cloth marker concealed in the wrong pocket. It was still possible. These were neighboring facts rather than married ones, but they had begun to show a family resemblance. He finished his tea. "Where is Miss Cresswell now?" "At home, I believe," said Mrs. Veal. "Mrs. Housekeeper took her." "And Mrs. Housekeeper, the committee chairman, lives in Cedar House, by the lane." Pirbright nodded. "Constable, before we call on anyone else, I think we shall go up the tower." Blaine set down his cup too quickly. "Tonight, sir?" "Yes. Murder does not improve by sleeping on it, and neither do village secrets." As they stepped back into the square, the clock face hung above them in pale distortion. Still wrong, still impassive. Behind the reading room windows, the women bent together at once, not from malice but from civic momentum, and somewhere above the hall roof, beyond the dark line of stone steps and locked doors, the upper part of the tower waited with the patience of things that have been undisturbed for years, and do not intend to explain themselves willingly. The lower tower door yielded at once to one of the keys on Bixby's ring, which spared Pirbright the trouble of turning the brass key in public before he knew what public it belonged to. He preferred, where possible, to let an object keep its vanity a little longer. Blaine held the lamp. Pirbright went first up the spiral stair, one hand near the central column, pausing every few steps to look, not dramatically but thoroughly, at the worn stone underfoot. The air altered as they climbed. It became colder, dustier, and touched with the dry mineral smell of enclosed brick. Sound behaved differently too. Their footfalls rose above them in a muffled advance, as if others were going on ahead to inspect what awaited. At the first turning there was nothing but a narrow slit of window and a shelf of old cobweb. At the second, a locked plank door stood in the outer wall, iron-banded and stubborn. A modern Yale lock had been fitted clumsily over older woodwork, as though trust had once been lost here and then, bureaucratically restored. Pirbright stopped. "That will be the committee storage," said Blaine, "so we are told." He took the separate brass key from his pocket and held it beneath the lamp. The red strip of cloth, faded almost pink at the edges, hung like a small tired tongue. He put the key into the lock. It fitted with humiliating ease. Blaine let out a breath through his nose. So Miss Cresswell knew it. "She knew something," said Pirbright. "People do not always know keys in general. They know particular doors." He turned it. The lock gave after a stiff complaint. The door opened inward with a scrape along the floor. The room beyond was not large. It had probably once served as an intermediate maintenance chamber when the tower was built, and now contained the usual afterlife of local institutions: stacked trestle tables, a rolled banner pole, a broken coat stand, 3 boxes of programs tied with string, and a set of wooden shelves running along the back wall. The lamp showed dust where dust ought to be, neglect where neglect was expected, and one recent disturbance where neither belonged. On the middle shelf an oblong space had been cleared. Pirbright did not speak at once. He crossed the room slowly, examining the floorboards. They were filmed with dust except near the entrance, and before the shelves, where faint marks showed that something heavy had recently been lifted away. On the shelf itself a pale rectangle remained, cleaner than the surrounding wood. "A book," said Blaine. "Yes, or a box shaped with unusual literary ambition." Pirbright crouched and shone the lamp sideways. Dust is a more loyal recorder than paper. It forgets less. There were finger trails on the front edge of the shelf, and a blunt drag where an object had been pulled forward before being removed. Not long ago. Perhaps that afternoon. He straightened. "Has anyone inventoried what was kept here?" Blaine looked doubtful. "In this village, sir, they probably call that memory." Pirbright's mouth moved slightly. "Then we must locate its best surviving specimen." The room gave up little else. An old cash tin stood empty on the lower shelf. A coil of bunting drooped from a hook. In one corner lay a cracked framed photograph of some forgotten Jubilee procession, in which men with whiskers and women in white dresses stood arranged around the tower itself, as if they had been proud of it then, and had not yet learned better. Pirbright examined the door from the inside. No sign of forcing. Whoever opened it had used the key. "Bugsby had the key in his pocket," said Blaine. "Or someone put it there." "You think he came up here?" "I think he either came up here or was made relevant to what happened here. The dead are often inconveniently central." They climbed higher. At the next landing, another door admitted them to the clock chamber. The mechanism loomed in the lamplight, like a dark machine for manufacturing apology. Gears, rods, and weights occupied most of the space. The wooden floor trembled faintly underfoot, with the internal strain of things meant to move regularly, and no longer enjoying it. One access hatch stood open behind the works, where a man might reach the striking mechanism. Pirbright bent near it. A smear of fresh grease marked the timber edge. Close by lay a small spanner. "Mr. Biggers was no clocksmith, I suppose," he said. Blaine shook his head. "Not that anyone mentioned. General caretaker. Yet someone interfered here, unless the bell developed independent opinions." He looked over the movement. He was not mechanically gifted, but he had spent enough time around sabotage devices, altered lamps, cut telephone wires, and village men who insisted on explaining valves to know the broad distinction between wear and tampering. One lever had been crudely wedged, so that the striking train could release out of sequence. It would not require brilliance, only access, privacy, and a willingness to climb a great many steps for a very English kind of deception. "The bell was made to strike wrong," he said. "Why?" Pirbright glanced up toward the belfry gloom. "Because someone wanted attention, or confusion. Very often they arrive arm in arm." They descended again, and locked the storage room behind them. The brass key returned to Pirbright's coat. Outside, the square had emptied further. Only the vicar remained visible, standing under the reading room lamp with his bicycle beside him, and the patient expression of a man who suspects he will still be needed even after usefulness has become theoretical. Pirbright crossed to him. "You have my sympathy." "For what?" "For serving where everybody knows everyone, and nobody knows enough." Calder gave a tired smile. "That could be printed on the parish magazine." Pirbright asked whether he knew what was normally kept in the storage room inside the tower. "Committee archives, old donation records, hall accounts, minute books, village appeals, that sort of thing. Miss Cresswell manages most of it. Mrs. Halcombe presides over it. Mr. Bigsby locks it. And if something were missing," the vicar considered, "Miss Cresswell would know first." "That," said Pirbright, "is beginning to seem probable." He sent Blaine to fetch Mrs. Halcombe, who arrived 20 minutes later, wrapped in a dark wool coat and an air of principled fatigue. She was a broad, capable woman in her 60s, with handsome silver hair and the voice of someone long accustomed to ending discussion by giving it a chair and an agenda. Cedar House had not softened her. If anything, it had confirmed her in the belief that people function best when sorted. "This is an unpleasant business," she said at once. "Poor Mr. Bixby. One could be exasperated by him without wishing him murdered." "Was he?" asked Pirbright. She met that directly. "I assume your presence implies it. I have not yet committed myself, but I am interested in the storage room in the tower. Something appears to have been removed from the shelves." Mrs. Holcomb's expression changed by degrees rather than shock. Recognition came first, then displeasure, then calculation over what recognition had revealed too soon. What sort of thing? A ledger, perhaps? She looked toward the tower door and then back at him. There are several ledgers. A pause followed. Finally she said, if one is missing, it may be the old benefactor's fund book. Pirbright waited. It contains subscriptions, donations, small trust disbursements, repairs to village property, that kind of thing. It goes back decades, mostly useless now, mostly. Mrs. Holcomb took off one glove finger by finger, not because the room was warm but because she preferred her hands free when obliged to be accurate. About 15 years ago, there was some tiresome dispute over a bequest connected to the clock tower and reading room. Nothing criminal, merely badly drafted intentions from a dead man, and too many living opinions. The dead man being Oswald Vere, retired solicitor, left money for upkeep of the tower, educational use of the reading room, and one or two local amenities of exhausting vagueness. He believed posterity would behave sensibly. This was optimistic, and the ledger recorded matters relating to the bequest. Some of them, expenditure, committee resolutions, references to correspondence. Miss Cresswell handled much of the filing then, as now. Pirbright watched her. Why did you not mention this before? Because until 10 seconds ago I did not know anything was missing from the shelf. Yes, but you knew at once what might be. Mrs. Holcomb's jaw settled. Inspector, when one has chaired village committees for 12 years, one acquires a refined instinct for which old documents are capable of causing fresh nuisance. That was probably true. It also avoided the more interesting matter. Who had access? Officially Mr. Bixby, Miss Cresswell, and myself. Unofficially, no one should. We are discussing a village, not a fortress, he asked when she had last seen the benefactor's fund ledger. Months ago. Autumn perhaps. Miss Cresswell brought it out during preparations for the hall insurance review. Bixby complained about dust. We ignored him. And today, I have been at home until called here. I took Miss Cresswell back with me earlier, because she was shaken. She is still there. How shaken? Mrs. Holcomb's eyes narrowed slightly. Enough to be human, not enough to collapse. Did she say anything about the ledger? No, about Mr. Bixby, she said. Only that he had been dreadful lately. In what sense? Guarded, irritable, possessive about keys, more so than usual. He had lately refused Miss Cresswell access to the tower room unless he was present. Pirbright let that settle. Why? I did not ask. One tries to ration inquiry in village administration or one becomes a fanatic. At that moment Blaine re-entered with Alice Morven, the library volunteer, who had been sent for after Pirbright recalled the title. Miss Cresswell had returned that afternoon. Alice looked surprised to find the committee chairwoman there, but not sufficiently surprised to be foolish. Pirbright asked her whether the book returned by Miss Cresswell had been requested through ordinary interest or from the back reserve. From reserve, said Alice. It's not on the public shelves. Did she ask for it specially? Yes. Yesterday. She said she wanted to check an old endowment note connected to the reading room windows. Mrs. Holcomb made a dry sound. The windows have not needed moral attention since 1998. Alice continued. I brought it out this morning. She sat reading it for about half an hour before taking it home, then returned it in the afternoon. Did she mention finding what she wanted? No, but she copied something into her notebook. Did you see what? Alice looked offended by the suggestion. No. Pirbright apologized with courtesy and asked one thing more. Was anyone else in the library reserve room today? Only me, and Mrs. Vale, briefly looking for church fete lists from old newspapers. That seems entirely in character. When Alice had gone, silence occupied the hall for a few moments. The clock tower above them remained black and shut, keeping its altered mechanism and vacant shelf to itself. A dead caretaker, a missing ledger, an old bequest, and Miss Cresswell reading about local trusts on the very day the bell was deliberately made to ring wrong. The shape was improving, though not yet honestly. Pirbright turned to Mrs. Holcomb. I think I should like to speak with Miss Cresswell again, tonight. Mrs. Holcomb drew her gloves back on. I imagine you should. As they stepped out into the square, the clock face showed 10 minutes past 5. The village had gone to ground at last, but not to sleep. Behind curtains and parlour lamps, Larkminster was reordering its loyalties, and somewhere, in some drawer or bag or private hiding place, reached in haste before supper. An old ledger that had lain quietly ignored for years had begun, by its absence alone, to accuse. The first rain began just after 9, thin at first and uncertain, like a thought that had not yet decided to trouble anyone. It tapped quietly on the square's cobbles, and slid down the clock tower bricks in narrow reflective streaks. By the time Inspector Pirbright and Constable Blaine reached Cedar House, the rain had become steadier, settling over Larkminster with the particular persistence of English weather that does not intend drama, but will not be hurried away. Cedar House stood a short distance off the main lane, behind a low iron gate, and 2 patient yew trees. Its windows glowed with orderly light. Mrs. Housekeeper let them in herself, as if she had expected the knock before it arrived. "Miss Cresswell is in the sitting room," she said. She insisted on waiting up. The sitting room was warm lamplit, and carefully arranged around the principle that chairs should face one another only when necessary. Miss Cresswell sat upright on the edge of a sofa, a wool shawl around her shoulders. A teacup stood untouched on the table beside her. Her composure had returned in outward form, though it now had the look of something constructed rather than natural. Pirbright removed his hat and greeted her politely. "I hope we are not causing you unnecessary fatigue." "Fatigue would be preferable to speculation," she said. "The village will already have decided half a dozen things. Villages are admirably efficient in that respect." He remained standing for a moment, studying her in the same quiet way he studied stair treads and dust marks. Then he sat in the chair opposite. "We have been in the tower." Her fingers moved once against the edge of the shawl. "And we found that the storage room had been opened. Something appears to have been removed from a shelf." Miss Cresswell looked down briefly, as if checking whether the carpet had changed color. "I suppose that was inevitable." "What was?" "The discovery." Pirbright let the word rest in the air before speaking again. "The key for that room was in Mr. Bixby's pocket." She said nothing. "It was not on his usual key ring," he continued. "It was loose, marked with a strip of red cloth. A rather distinctive key." Miss Cresswell's gaze moved toward the window, where rain slid slowly across the glass. "You showed it to me earlier." "Yes, and you denied recognizing it." "That seemed simpler." "Simpler for whom?" "For everyone," she said quietly. The room held a moment of stillness. Mrs. Housekeeper stood near the mantelpiece, her expression neither supportive nor hostile. It suggested that she believed truth should arrive promptly, but knew from experience that it seldom did. Pirbright spoke with the same calm patience he had used all evening. "Miss Cresswell, a caretaker is dead at the base of the tower stairs. The bell mechanism above him has been deliberately altered. The storage room he normally controlled has been opened with a key found in his pocket, and a ledger connected to an old village bequest appears to have disappeared from the shelf where it was kept. You may appreciate that simplicity is no longer especially helpful." She nodded once, slowly. "I opened the room." Mrs. Housekeeper inhaled sharply. Pirbright did not move. "When?" "This afternoon." "Before or after the bell rang?" "Before." "How long before?" "I went there shortly after 3. "Why?" Miss Cresswell folded her hands together. "Because I needed the benefactor's fund ledger." "Needed it for what?" "To confirm something I had begun to suspect." "What had you begun to suspect?" She hesitated, then spoke with careful control. "That the account entries from several years ago were not correct." Mrs. Housekeeper straightened. "Not correct in what sense?" "In the sense that money assigned to tower maintenance may have been used elsewhere." "Elsewhere where?" Miss Cresswell's eyes lifted to meet Pirbright's. "I don't know yet. That was what I hoped to find out." Pirbright leaned back slightly. "You went to the tower at 3 o'clock. Did Mr. Bixby know you were going?" "No." "Did you have permission to take the ledger?" "I had responsibility for it." "That was not my question." "No," she admitted. "How did you obtain the key?" She looked at the carpet again. "I borrowed it." "From Mr. Bixby?" "No." "From whom?" she answered after a pause. "From Mrs. Housekeeper." Mrs. Housekeeper stared at her. "I never gave you the tower key. You gave it to me 2 years ago when the archive boxes were reorganized. You told me to keep it safe, in case Bixby misplaced his. I told you to return it after the work was finished." "I intended to." The rain thickened against the windows. Pirbright said gently, "Where is the ledger now?" Miss Cresswell closed her eyes for a moment before answering. "I don't have it." "Did you remove it from the shelf?" "Yes." "Then what happened?" She opened her eyes again, and this time the composure had shifted into something closer to fatigue. "Mr. Bixby came up the stairs while I was still in the room. Blaine, standing near the doorway, shifted slightly. What time was this? Pirbright asked. Perhaps 20 minutes past 3. I cannot be exact. What did he say? He demanded to know why I was there. And I told him I needed the ledger. He became very angry. Angry enough to strike you. No. Angry enough to threaten. What sort of threat? He said. The ledger did not belong to me, that it would cause trouble if anyone began reading old matters, that I should put it back and leave. Did you? No. What happened then? Miss Cresswell's voice dropped slightly. He tried to take it from me. Pirbright waited. I refused. Did the two of you struggle? Not exactly. Then how? He blocked the doorway and insisted I leave without it. I told him he had no right. He said he had every right, because the tower belonged to people who understood its history. That sounds rather philosophical for a caretaker. He was not philosophical, she said quietly. He was frightened. Of what? I don't know. And the ledger, I took it past him when he moved to lock the door. You simply walked out. Yes. Did he attempt to stop you? He followed me onto the stairs. Then what? Miss Cresswell's fingers tightened. I went down quickly. He was behind me. We argued. About the ledger? Yes. Did anyone else hear? I don't think so. Did you reach the bottom together? No. She paused. I was halfway down when the bell mechanism began moving. Blaine frowned. The bell? Yes. You're saying it started then? Yes. Pirbright said nothing for several seconds. What did Mr. Bixby do? He stopped. On the stairs. Yes. Why? He thought someone had interfered with the clock. And you? I continued down. Did you see what happened after that? No. You did not see him fall? No. You left him on the stairs and went back to the square? Yes. At what time? I cannot be certain. Pirbright considered the rain, the clock tower beyond the dark trees, and the strange sequence of a caretaker pausing mid-argument, because the bell mechanism above had suddenly begun to move. Miss Cresswell, he said finally, when the bell rang 6 at 11 minutes past 4, where were you? In the square. And the ledger? Her answer came almost immediately. At home. Mrs. Holcombe spoke sharply. You took it here? Yes. Where is it now? Miss Cresswell looked toward the small writing desk near the far wall. In that drawer. Blaine crossed the room and opened it carefully. Inside lay a thick leather-bound book with cracked edges and a label faded nearly white with age. The Benefactors Fund Ledger, he said. Pirbright rose and walked over. He opened it slowly. The entries were written in neat, consistent handwriting that stretched back across decades of village life. Donations, repairs, committee votes, small expenditures carefully recorded in tidy columns. Then several pages from the end, the writing changed. Numbers had been altered, amounts crossed out and rewritten, and beside one entry concerning the clock tower maintenance fund, someone had written a small note in the margin. Pirbright read it quietly. Then he closed the ledger. Outside, the rain fell harder on the cobbles, and the dark tower stood motionless against the sky. Miss Cresswell, he said calmly, who wrote this correction? She did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was almost steady. Leonard Bixby. And somewhere beyond the rain, far above the quiet village roofs, the bell mechanism inside the tower settled slowly back into silence. Pirbright did not reopen the ledger at once. He stood with one hand resting lightly on the desk, as though the old leather volume might yet volunteer some final correction if treated with patience. Miss Cresswell remained on the sofa, her shawl drawn a little closer now, while Mrs. Holcombe looked from one face to another, with the expression of a woman who had spent years keeping minutes at meetings, and disliked any occasion on which the facts refused to line up in a sensible order. You say Bixby wrote that note himself, said Pirbright. Yes. And you saw him do so? No. But he told me he had done it. When? 3 days ago. Pirbright turned toward her. That is a detail which might have been useful earlier. Yes, she said. A number of things would have been useful earlier. It was not impertinent. It was simply exhausted, and for that reason more effective. Blaine, who had been studying the ledger from an angle that gave him no real advantage, looked up. Sir? Pirbright handed him the book. Take a careful look at the altered entries. Blaine did so, his brow furrowed with the effort of matching numbers to significance. There are several adjustments, he said. Tower maintenance, roof works, one payment to a stone mason, and another listed as emergency repairs, which appear to have become larger with age, said Pirbright. Miss Cresswell said, that is why I went for the ledger. Mr. Bixby asked me on Tuesday whether I had ever compared the committee minutes with the account book. I said I had not. He told me, rather oddly, that anyone who did so now would find the village had been more inventive with figures than with architecture. Mrs. Holcomb's mouth tightened. Who exactly is the village in this case? That, said Pirbright, is one of the points we must avoid settling too early. He took his hat from the side table. Miss Cresswell, I would rather the ledger remained here for the moment. Constable Blaine will collect it shortly under proper record. Until then I suggest you say nothing further about it to anyone. She gave a small dry laugh. In Larkminster, Inspector, silence is generally interpreted as confession. Then you may console yourself with being thought fashionable. Mrs. Holcomb, despite herself, almost smiled. Outside, the rain had softened from insistence to a long damp murmur. The lane glistened black beneath the lamps. Pirbright and Blaine went back toward the square in measured silence, the sort that indicated thought rather than comfort. Water gathered at the edges of the paving stones, and reflected the clock tower in broken strips of yellow light. At the corner by the reading room, Blaine said, "Do you believe her?" "I believe she has stopped lying in the most obvious way," said Pirbright. "That is not quite the same thing. She admits taking the ledger and arguing with Bixby on the stairs. Yes, she leaves him there, and later he is found dead. Also yes." Blaine glanced toward the tower. "That gives her a rather poor position. It gives her a visible one. One must never confuse the two." They had almost reached the square when a voice called softly from across the street, "Inspector." Mrs. Dallimore stood beneath the awning of the draper's shop, clutching a folded umbrella she had evidently forgotten to open. She was a narrow woman of exact habits, whose greatest gift, apart from hemming curtains without visible stitches, was hearing things not addressed to her, and retaining them with moral seriousness. Pirbright crossed to her. "You are out late, Mrs. Dallimore." "I was at my sister's," she said, as if this itself required formal documentation. "And then I heard from Mrs. Pike that there had been some dreadful disturbance at the tower, and I thought perhaps I ought to mention something." Blaine had already produced his notebook with a speed that suggested professional hope. Pirbright said, "Perhaps we might step under shelter." She joined them beneath the draper's overhang, where the smell of wet fabric and old soap drifted faintly from the closed shop. "I am not one to repeat things merely because they sound odd," Mrs. Dallimore began. "No one would accuse you of frivolity," said Pirbright. "I should hope not." This was around 4 o'clock. A little before, perhaps. I had gone into the lane behind the reading room, because I had left a parcel of mending with Mrs. Unstey this afternoon, and realized I'd failed to collect my scissors. "Your own scissors?" "Yes, they cut properly. Hers do not." "A serious matter." She gave him a brief look, uncertain whether she was being supported or challenged, then continued, "As I came back toward the square, I heard voices from near the bottom of the tower path." "How many voices?" "Two at first." "Can you identify them?" "One was Mr. Bixby's. I know his voice perfectly well. He always sounded as if he disapproved of people in the abstract." "A useful distinction," murmured Pirbright. "And the other," she said, "was a man, not loud but sharp, educated." Blaine looked up from the notebook. "Not a village voice?" Mrs. Dallimore considered this. "No, or not entirely. He spoke like someone accustomed to being listened to in rooms with curtains." Pirbright let that pass. "What did you hear?" "Not every word. The rain had just started, and the tower stones throw sound about strangely. But I heard Mr. Bixby say, very clearly, 'You've had your share already.' Then the other man said something I could not catch. Then Mr. Bixby said, 'I kept quiet, because I was told to keep quiet.' That is not the same as agreeing." Blaine scribbled hard enough to endanger the paper. "Was there more?" asked Pirbright. "Yes. The other man said, 'You will do exactly as before.' I am nearly certain of that. It was not shouted, which somehow made it worse. Then there was a pause, and I heard Mr. Bixby say, 'Not with her poking into it.'" "Not now." "Her," said Pirbright. "Yes. Could he have meant Miss Cresswell? I cannot say. I only heard the word." Pirbright's eyes moved briefly toward the dark outline of the tower. "What did you do then?" Mrs. Dallimore drew herself up a little. "I went no closer. It did not seem proper, entirely understandable. I came out toward the square by the long path instead. Then, a little later, the bell rang when it should not have rung, and everyone behaved as if the weather had suddenly become theatrical." "Did you see the second man?" "No. Only a sleeve, perhaps, near the path wall. Dark coat. That could describe half the men in Larkminster, and all the dull ones. Blaine coughed into his hand. Pirbright said, "Did you hear this conversation before or after Miss Cresswell and Mr. Bixby argued on the stairs. Mrs. Dallimore blinked. "I did not hear any argument on the stairs. Quite. I am asking for the time as best you judge it. It must have been after 4, not long before the bell." He nodded slowly. "That is helpful. There is one more thing," she said. Pirbright waited. "When I reached the square, I saw Dr. Felton coming out of the side passage by the vestry gate." Blaine stopped writing. "Are you sure?" Pirbright asked. "Oh yes. He nearly walked into me and apologized twice, which is not his usual method. He looked wet and annoyed." "At what time?" "A minute or 2 before the bell. I remember because I thought he had no business being in that part of the square unless someone had sent for him, and no one seemed to have done so yet." Pirbright's tone remained mild, but something in it settled. "Did Dr. Felton speak to you?" he said. "Be careful, Mrs. Dallimore, the stones are slippery," which was sensible enough, though he said it while looking behind him instead of at me. Behind him toward what? The tower. Rain dripped steadily from the awning. Across the square the light in the post office had gone out. The village seemed to be drawing inward for the night, but not to rest. Larkminster, when troubled, became quieter rather than louder, like a person who had heard something at dinner and intended to remember it privately for years. Pirbright thanked Mrs. Dallimore and watched her go, umbrella still shut, stepping around puddles with the care of one who believed damp shoes a moral failure. Blaine closed his notebook. So Bixby argued with another man shortly before the bell, a man who told him to do exactly as before, and Dr. Felton was near the vestry gate before anyone officially summoned him. Yes, then Miss Cresswell may not have been the last person to see Bixby alive. She almost certainly was not. Blaine hesitated. "Do you think Bixby was being pressured over the ledger entries?" "I think Bixby had reached the regrettable condition in which a man knows too much of one old arrangement and too little of another." They stood a moment longer under the awning, both looking toward the tower. Its clock face shone pale through the rain, bland and municipal, giving no sign that beneath its respectable exterior people had begun lying in different directions for different reasons. At last Pirbright said, "We shall speak to Dr. Felton in the morning. Tonight, however, I should like one more look at those belfry steps. Now, sir, rain alters small things. Sometimes it improves them." They crossed the square again, and went up the tower path, where the wet stones gleamed under their lamps. The gate stood where Blaine had latched it earlier. Beyond it, the steps climbed in narrow darkness beside the wall. Water ran down the edges in thin channels and dripped from the iron rail. Pirbright lifted his lamp and examined the lower steps first, then the side wall, then the strip of ground beside the railing where the rain had flattened the weeds. For several moments he said nothing. Then he bent and picked something from the crack between 2 stones. Blaine stepped nearer. "What is it?" Pirbright held it up in the lamplight. A small button, black and polished, with a broken thread still clinging to its holes. "Doctor's coat," said Blaine. "Possibly, or schoolmaster's, or solicitor's. English respectability is very monotonous in its fastening." He slipped the button carefully into an envelope. Then his gaze moved to the wall again, where rain had darkened the stone except for one narrow patch beneath the rail. There, half protected from the weather, was a faint smear of chalk. Not builder's chalk. White, dry, recent. Blaine saw it too. "What do you make of that?" Pirbright studied the mark without touching it. "Nothing yet," he said, "but I do not think the tower has finished speaking." Pirbright arrived at Mrs. Halcombe's house shortly after midday. The drizzle from the previous evening had left the lanes slick and silent, and the village felt unusually withdrawn, as though it had been asked to listen without comment. He knocked once, twice, and was admitted immediately by the housekeeper, a careful woman with a gaze that suggested she both knew and disapproved of human unpredictability. The sitting room held the faint aroma of boiled cabbage and tea, mingling with the sharper note of polished wood. Mrs. Housekeeper sat at the head of the table, her expression perfected into polite attentiveness, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation. "You are punctual," she said, placing a plate in front of him. "I trust the roads were unremarkable." "Mostly," said Pirbright, though he noted a streak of mud across his cuff that argued otherwise. "And you?" "Entirely controlled. One must preserve civility even when the village conspires in silence." They began to eat. The luncheon itself was simple: cold meats, unbuttered bread, a modest salad. Conversation moved between food and village routine in the way that British domestic meals often do, superficially mundane yet charged beneath with small pointed observations. Pirbright noted the subtle way she sliced the meat, methodically but with a certain tension in her fingers. "Have you spoken to Miss Cresswell since yesterday?" she asked, eyes glancing toward the window where the light fell unevenly across the tablecloth. "I have," said Pirbright. "She is forthcoming to a degree, though naturally careful." Mrs. Housekeeper's spoon paused. "Naturally careful, yes. One cannot rely entirely on propriety when serious matters arise." "Agreed," he said, cutting a piece of meat with precision. "And yet," he added, "one often finds that propriety conceals as much as it reveals." She regarded him carefully. "We all have our methods, Inspector." "Indeed. And your own, Mrs. Housekeeper, are formidable." Her lips tightened faintly. "Flattery is not necessary. I offer none," he said. "Merely observation." A silence followed, broken only by the slight scrape of cutlery. Outside, the light changed as clouds passed, leaving the room in gentle shadow. Pirbright shifted slightly, letting his gaze sweep the room with slow purpose. There were papers on the sideboard, neatly stacked but not overly so, indicating readiness to record yet not to reveal. It was an environment that preserved appearances while allowing discreet deviations. "About the ledger," he said, lowering his voice, "I am aware that several entries had been altered. Miss Cresswell has acknowledged retrieving it, and Bixby may have been concerned by her actions. But I would like your account of any unusual occurrences yesterday." Mrs. Housekeeper's expression remained placid. "Unusual is a broad term. The tower has its rhythms, and Mr. Bixby had his peculiarities. I noticed nothing particularly alarming until the bell rang out of sequence." "Did you see anyone else near the tower path?" Her fingers tapped once on the tabletop. "Dr. Felton passed by as usual around mid-afternoon. He seemed impatient. I cannot say whether he intended to ascend, though I assumed not." "Was anyone else present?" Pirbright pressed. "No, the square was largely empty, but I did observe Mrs. Dallimore lingering near the lane, which is not uncommon when she is concerned about the weather." "That is consistent with other reports," said Pirbright. He took a small sip of tea, noticing its slight bitterness and the effect of cooling on the palate. "Did Bixby mention anything about the ledger in your presence yesterday?" "Not directly," she replied, "though he did remark to me that Miss Cresswell ought to mind herself. He has always had an inclination toward territorial propriety. I advised him against fussing," she said. "He paid me little heed." They continued eating in measured silence for several minutes, the rhythm of their motions punctuated by small gestures, adjusting a napkin, shifting a chair. Pirbright observed these attentively, noting the subtle indications of thought and restraint that often spoke louder than words. "Was there any sign that Mr. Bixby anticipated interference yesterday?" he asked. She considered. He appeared more vigilant than usual. Not anxious, precisely, but attentive. He checked the key locations before lunch, and spoke in curt tones with Miss Cresswell. She seemed uneasy. "And you?" "I remained at my post in the hall, supervising routine tasks. One must maintain appearances, Inspector, even when one senses potential complication." "Indeed," said Pirbright. He set down his cutlery and leaned slightly forward. "Did you see any conflict between Bixby and anyone else, besides Miss Cresswell?" Mrs. Housekeeper shook her head. "No, but one can observe tension in ways beyond spoken words." "Such as?" Her fingers rested lightly on the table. "The way he held himself on the stairs, the way his eyes flicked toward doors, the subtle adjustment of keys and ledgers, small gestures, easily overlooked, yet revealing if one knows where to look." Pirbright nodded, noting the careful phrasing. "Very helpful. And the bell itself? Any indication of tampering prior to its striking irregularly?" She pursed her lips. I cannot say. The mechanism is complex, and I do not claim expertise. Only that the bell has its own temperaments, which Mr. Bixby sometimes argued were unpredictable. But yesterday it rang precisely when it should not. Pirbright exhaled softly. Then we are left with timing, access and observation. All converge around the square and tower between 3 and 4. You observed nothing else, and no one else approached the path while the bell's irregularity occurred. Only the usual passers-by, none of whom interacted with Bixby or Miss Cresswell during that interval. Everyone was careful, as is their habit. He tapped the edge of his cup lightly. Your account is consistent and restrained. That in itself is a valuable guide. Thank you, Mrs. Housekeeper. She inclined her head slightly. Inspector, I do not suppose luncheon provides much illumination on irregularities, yet it seems we have discussed them thoroughly. An unhelpful luncheon, Pirbright allowed, is sometimes the most instructive meal of all. He stood, gathering his coat. I shall take the liberty of examining the tower path once more. Rain may have washed away certain traces, but not all. Mrs. Holcombe rose as well. Do not tarry. Evening descends quickly in Larkminster. Her glance toward the window hinted at concern, curiosity, and the habitual control of those who preside over both schedules and secrets. As they left, the village square lay empty beneath clouded light, and Pirbright's mind worked through every gesture, pause, and whispered observation of the morning. Each small, seemingly unremarkable event now carried the weight of sequence and intention, and somewhere between the wet stones, the square, and the looming tower, the next revelation waited patiently. The afternoon had shifted into a muted late light, the kind that made the stone of the clock tower appear almost ashen, and the lanes between cottages more like corridors than thoroughfares. Pirbright walked slowly beside Blaine toward the vestry path, each step measured as if to weigh not only distance but implication. The village seemed to hold its breath, or perhaps it was merely the quiet gathering weight of drizzle still clinging to eaves and gutters. Blaine, Pirbright began, we have established sequence and access, yet the ledger and the bell remain only partially explained. We need context. Context in Larkminster tends to be thinly veiled, said Blaine, glancing toward a narrow window in the tower where light was absent, yet shadowed in ways that suggested occupation, and people guard promises as though they were deeds. Precisely, Pirbright said. He adjusted the lapel of his coat and let his gaze roam across the path lined with wet moss. We are searching not merely for physical evidence, but for the form a promise has taken over years, often unnoticed until stress compels revelation. At the corner where the path narrowed beside the tower wall, Mrs. Cresswell appeared, her shawl damp at the edges, face composed but eyes wary. She had come without announcement, the deliberate unpredictability of her movements as much a feature of her character as any habit of routine. Inspector, she said quietly, I thought it best to speak before evening fully descends. Your timing is, as ever, careful, Pirbright observed, and necessary. She stepped closer, so that the lamplight fell across the faint damp of her hair. There is something I must admit, something regarding Mr. Bixby that I neglected to mention before. It concerns an arrangement he had with the late Mr. Holloway, the previous caretaker. Blaine stiffened slightly. Holloway? He retired 5 years ago, did he not? Yes, she said. But before he left, Bixby and Holloway had a private understanding, something agreed between them concerning the upkeep of the tower and the accounting of funds. Though Holloway never wrote it down, Bixby considered it a gentleman's promise. Pirbright nodded slowly. A promise in the abstract, then. How did this bear upon yesterday's events? Miss Cresswell looked down, fidgeting with the hem of her shawl. Bixby feared someone would discover the discrepancy between the old arrangements and the ledger. He believed the promise would be revealed and judged harshly. Blaine exhaled. So the ledger was a point of potential exposure, not merely clerical concern. Exactly, she said, and he made it clear he would resist any interference, especially if outsiders became involved. Pirbright glanced at her, noting the faint tremor in her voice despite the control of her posture. And you? I took the ledger because I suspected the funds were not properly allocated. But I never intended to force a confrontation. I only wanted to confirm my suspicions. Blaine scribbled furiously in his notebook. So the problem is historical. A promise, long unrecorded, now clashing with present duties and observation. Yes, she said, and that is why the argument on the stairs became inevitable. Bixby's fear was less about me personally, and more about the promise being known outside the circle who understood it. Pirbright's gaze returned to the tower, its face pale against a grey sky. This shapes our understanding of the motive, certainly. It also explains why the mechanism was tampered with. The bell, the ledger, even his response, he sought to protect not only the funds but the memory of an agreement. And the second man Mrs. Dallimore heard. Blaine asked, "Does he relate to the promise?" "Perhaps," said Miss Cresswell. Bixby had mentioned a solicitor who occasionally consulted on the fund. That man may have arrived precisely to remind Bixby of obligations, or to enforce silence. Pirbright considered this. Then we must be cautious. Exposure of the ledger and the promise it embodies is what triggers the social and ultimately the fatal consequences. Fatal? She asked, startled. Bixby's accident, whether caused by misstep or interference, is framed within a tension extending from loyalty, secrecy and obligation, Pirbright said. Each step on the stairs, each glance toward the path, carries weight precisely because of the promise. The rain softened further, drawing long streaks across the pavement. The village, still and damp, seemed to await interpretation rather than explanation. Pirbright's expression, calm yet deliberate, suggested the mind was turning over every prior fact in light of this revelation. The promise, long hidden in shadow and memory, now cast a shape across the entire chain of events. "So what do we do now?" Blaine asked. Pirbright straightened. "We establish sequence, examine what traces remain, and understand who knew of the promise. Only then will the remainder of the narrative, the actions that led to Bixby's fall, the irregular bell, and the ledger's disappearance take form. The old promise has defined the present. We must treat it as carefully as Bixby did, though with less fear of error." Miss Cresswell watched him, silent. Outside, the tower loomed, indifferent to the human constructions below. Its stones, damp with rain and centuries of use, seemed to hold a patient record of both promises kept and broken, awaiting only the eyes willing to read them. Pirbright returned to the tower in the early morning, the square still wet with dew and residual drizzle. Blaine followed at a measured distance, aware that every footstep disturbed not only puddles, but the subtle evidence left behind by those who had passed the previous day. The inspector carried his lamp and a small leather satchel, moving deliberately, as though the very pace of his walk might draw confidences from the stone walls themselves. "Have you considered," Pirbright said quietly, "the possibility that the ledger's significance is less about its entries than about the way it concealed access?" Blaine glanced toward him. "Access? You mean to the funds or the building?" "Both. The tower is old enough to possess more than one secret, and yesterday's irregularities suggest that someone knew precisely where to find, what to find without obvious movement." They reached the main door, which Pirbright pushed open with a faint creak. Inside, the scent of damp stone mingled with the faint trace of wax from polished steps. He moved along the wall toward the paneling that flanked the stairwell, his fingers brushing over the wood. The grain offered no initial indication of interruption, yet he paused at a slight unevenness near the bottom. "See here," he murmured, pointing. "The paneling has been disturbed, though subtly. Not enough for casual detection. A man must have been familiar with its construction to manipulate it without leaving obvious traces." Blaine crouched to examine the lower seam. "It seems recent. The wood retains a small smear, faintly oily, as if someone had handled it quickly but with care." Pirbright's eyes narrowed. "The ledger alone would not necessitate this. No, it is something else behind here, a door or a recess, a hidden space preserving old arrangements. Correspondence, perhaps, the record of promises too delicate to risk exposure." He tapped lightly along the edges of the panel. There was a hollow note beneath the surface, almost musical in its subtlety. Carefully, he produced a slender tool from his satchel and worked along the seam. The panel shifted slightly and released a faint click. Blaine straightened. "Shall we open it?" he asked. Pirbright hesitated, scanning the room. "Caution, Blaine. We are about to intrude into something meant to remain concealed. Observe the sequence of light and shadow. There may be traces of recent human presence." He pressed gently, and the panel yielded. Behind it was indeed a narrow recess, scarcely more than a foot in depth, containing a small bundle of papers tied with twine. The edges were yellowed, the handwriting familiar yet distant in its careful loops. Pirbright lifted the bundle and examined the topmost sheet. It was an account, but unlike the ledger, it contained notes on promises, allocations and agreements, some crossed with pencil corrections, others merely annotated in the margin. Blaine looked over his shoulder. "This is the old promise you mentioned yesterday, isn't it?" "Precisely," said Pirbright. "Not merely a memory, but a recorded form, deliberately concealed from ordinary eyes. Mr. Bixby may have considered this both a shield and a key. Shield for his conduct, key for those who might need proof." "Do you think someone else knew about this?" Blaine asked. Pirbright's gaze did not leave the papers. "It seems likely. Otherwise, why the second man near the tower path? Why the instructions Mrs. Dallimore overheard?" This concealment had significance beyond personal curiosity. They moved closer to the stairs to see if the floor bore any further signs of disturbance. The stones were faintly wet, the footprints of previous visitors subdued but discernible with attention. Near the base of the wall, a small smear of chalk marked the beginning of a line that led from the panel to the stairs' first step. "Someone has traced a path deliberately," Pirbright observed. "The chalk is recent. The smudge aligns with the handling of this panel. There is intent here, Blaine, intent both to reveal and to obscure." Blaine furrowed his brow. So Bixby was trying to protect the promise, but someone else, possibly the solicitor, may have known precisely where to look. "Yes," said Pirbright, "and that knowledge explains the sequence. The ledger taken, the confrontation on the stairs, the irregular bell, and the panic that followed. Each movement in its proper context is more logical than we assumed yesterday." He set the bundle back carefully, and replaced the panel, leaving the chalked trace untouched. "We have seen the shape of the secret," he said, "and now we must consider the human element. Who knew, who followed protocol, and who acted against it? The tower preserves its story, but human action determines the final form." Blaine nodded, absorbing the measured precision of the discovery. The wet floor, the faint chalk, and the concealed papers formed a narrative that neither rain nor oversight could erase. As they stepped back into the square, the tower loomed above them, silent but now less opaque, its hidden door hinting at both loyalty and duplicity, the old promise still shaping events in ways only careful observation could reveal. The following evening, Pirbright summoned those with direct knowledge of the tower's events to the vestry, arranging chairs in a careful semicircle that forced observation without confrontation. Blaine took a position at the rear, notebook ready, while Miss Cresswell, Mrs. Cresswell, Mrs. Holcomb, and Dr. Felton occupied the nearer seats, each aware of the subtle hierarchy implied by placement and expectation. The lamplight fell across the polished floor, catching the dampness left from recent rain, and cast a muted glow over faces that were polite but guarded. Pirbright began without preamble. "We are here to reconcile sequence, presence, and motive. The bell's irregular ringing, the ledger's removal, and Mr. Bixby's fatal fall are all linked, not by accident, but by timing." He paused, letting the quiet settle before continuing. "Mrs. Dallimore's account indicates 2 men at the tower path shortly before 4 o'clock. One was Mr. Bixby, the other an outsider issuing instructions. Miss Cresswell's intervention and the ledger's temporary displacement occurred in that narrow window. Dr. Felton's movement near the vestry gate aligns with the same period." He gestured to the floor where a faint chalk line remained visible. "This mark indicates the path traced between the panel and the stairwell. The movement was deliberate, calculated to protect, and if necessary, conceal evidence. Timing then is essential. The so-called hour is no accident. It is a pivot upon which events turned." Blaine raised his hand. "Sir, the hour itself, why precisely 4 o'clock? Could it be coincidence that both the bell and the confrontation fell at that moment?" Pirbright shook his head. "Not coincidence, Blaine. Mr. Bixby's habits, the old promise, and the expected arrival of the solicitor converged. He was aware that any interference would likely occur in a narrow span when attention and observation intersected. 4 o'clock represented both opportunity and vulnerability. The hour is explained, therefore, by anticipation and knowledge of human patterns rather than mechanical whim." Miss Cresswell leaned forward. "So all the sequences we observed were orchestrated by circumstance as much as by intent?" "Correct," Pirbright replied. "Intent, yes, in the concealment of the panel, the handling of the ledger, and in the calculation of steps. Circumstance, yes, in the unavoidable arrival of other parties and the timing of the bell. Together they produced a chain that might appear haphazard, but is in fact logically aligned." Mrs. Holcomb added, her voice careful, "And Bixby's fall, was that part of the timing, or merely a result of misjudgment?" Pirbright's gaze remained steady. The fall was precipitated by multiple factors: wet steps, distraction from the ledger's disturbance, and the stress of potential exposure. It was not premeditated in the sense of malice, but entirely predictable, once sequence and pressure converged. Thus the hour is both literal and symbolic. It frames the moment in which these forces intersected. Dr. Felton, who had remained quiet, spoke at last. So the irregular bell, was that an accident or deliberate? Deliberate in a sense, Pirbright said. Bixby sought to control the perception of the tower, to mark time in a manner that kept the promise hidden until necessary observation confirmed who had accessed it. The bell signaled attention without causing overt alarm, a warning within routine. The hour explains the bell, the ledger, and the presence of all parties. Blaine scribbled rapidly. Then we understand the hour, but what of motive? Who benefits from its concealment? The promise itself, Pirbright said, contained allocations, rights, and obligations. Exposure threatened reputation and obligation alike. The hour was the hinge on which secrecy could be maintained or breached. By establishing the hour, we see not only the mechanism of the accident, but the social rationale that guided human action in those final moments. The group fell silent. Outside, a single lamplight reflected on damp pavement, the village quiet as though it too listened. Pirbright allowed the stillness to linger, permitting reflection rather than commentary. Timing, he understood, was the frame within which social complexity revealed its shapes. The hour had been explained. Now, understanding shifted toward those who moved within it. Each gesture, glance, and step was rational in the context of the hour, each action a consequence of knowledge, fear, or promise. He leaned back slightly. Sequence, presence, and motive are coherent now. The hour has clarified the order of human concern, intention, and misstep. We can proceed with consideration of consequences and responsibility, knowing the timing that shaped all that followed. By the following morning, the village had resumed a semblance of ordinary rhythm, though Pirbright noted subtle shifts in posture, glances, and civility that indicated the recent events had left an undercurrent of recalibration. He visited the square first, allowing his steps to trace the paths observed the previous days. The stones were dry now, and the faint chalk marks had been washed away, leaving only impressions discernible to the careful eye. Blaine followed at a measured pace, notebook closed for the moment, absorbing the quiet order beneath the apparent normality. Pirbright called the principal figures to meet at the vestry once more. Though this gathering was markedly less formal, the air softened by the passage of time and the absence of immediate crisis. Miss Cresswell, Mrs. Halcombe, Dr. Felton, and even Blaine assembled with an unspoken awareness that their perceptions were about to be subtly shifted. The inspector, standing at the front, allowed silence to settle, letting each participant consider what they believed to have known. The events of yesterday, Pirbright began, voice calm yet deliberate, have prompted reconsideration of sequence, motive, and consequence. What appeared chaotic, bell, ledger, fall, follows now a logical chain, informed by timing, knowledge of the old promise, and human anticipation. But the question remains, how do we adjust our understanding of responsibility? Miss Cresswell spoke first. I suppose one might see my interference as intrusive, yet necessary to confirm propriety. Precisely, said Pirbright. Yet interference alone does not define culpability. Context, knowledge of the hidden agreement, awareness of access points, and observation of human tendencies, frames interpretation. One must weigh both intent and circumstance. Dr. Felton nodded slowly. Then my own presence, passing the square at the critical hour, might seem suspicious but is merely coincidental. Not merely coincidental, Pirbright corrected gently. Relevant, but non-contributory to the misstep that led to Mr. Bixby's fall. It is the convergence of several minor, rational actions that produced the outcome, rather than a single deliberate act. Mrs. Holcomb's voice was careful, so everyone's view of one another, the ledger, the bell, the hidden panel, must shift in light of sequence and knowledge. Exactly, Pirbright said. We must rearrange opinions quietly, appreciating that social perception often magnifies apparent anomaly. The true alignment emerges when sequence, intent, and observation converge. No dramatic confrontation is required, merely recognition of what each knew, did, or feared. He allowed his gaze to pass slowly over the group. Miss Cresswell, you acted to preserve propriety. Dr. Felton, your path coincided without intention. Mrs. Holcombe, your oversight provided necessary restraint. Each action interlocks with the others, and when viewed collectively, explains the bell, the ledger, and the fall. Social dynamics, after all, are as instructive as any physical trace. Blaine leaned forward. So the village itself, the quiet observances, the customary habits played a part in preserving and revealing the truth. Indeed, Pirbright confirmed, villagers move, speak and pause according to habit, expectation and subtle understanding. The misalignment occurs only when novelty intersects with concealed knowledge. As with the promise, our task has been to reconstruct the sequence, not to assign blame where routine and coincidence explain events. A hush fell, punctuated only by the gentle tapping of a distant clock. Each participant absorbed the implications, reconsidering earlier suspicions, adjusting interpretations of gestures, and reweighing trust. The quiet rearrangement of opinions, imperceptible to the casual observer, was complete, each mind aligned with a fuller comprehension of motive, sequence and consequence. Human behavior, rather than mechanical error or deliberate malice, had shaped events. Acknowledgement, patience and reflection were sufficient to restore coherence. Pirbright closed his notes. Satisfied, the tower loomed outside, its stone indifferent yet faithful in recording action. The ledger rested where it should, the bell awaited its next cycle, and the old promise remained a testament to order maintained through discretion. In the village, civility resumed its primacy, subtly informed by the newly understood truths, and the observer could see the social landscape rearranged without a single confrontation, argument, or raised voice. The quiet work of perception and understanding had achieved resolution, leaving Larkminster calm but perceptive, its secrets now held gently by those who knew and those who had observed with care.